I, I, Ushvuatana la Tomorrow night, wearing our best white clothes, on the most important evening of the year, with dread and awe, we will usher in our most solemn, joyful, and holy day of Yom Kippur, with the words Kol Nidre, all of our vows, let them be null and void. Let us start the year, God, with a clean slate, community, each other, ourselves, with a clean slate. We're painfully aware of the many commitments we made that we didn't manage to keep. And we begin Yom Kippur with the sobering awareness that we haven't been good at keeping our promises. Why is this the particular act we choose to emphasize at the outset of Yom Kippur? Many of us have even already done Hatarat Nedarim, the formal release from our vows. Why focus on this particular thing as we begin Yom Kippur, our journey of Shuvah? To add another layer to this question, I invite you to remember with me what was happening on Yom Kippur night long before Kol Nidre was being recited, 2,000 years ago, at the exact same time that we say Kol Nidre. At that time, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, the hero of Yom Kippur, our agent and messenger to help achieve our atonement in God's eyes, just as we would be asking to be released from our vows, the Kohen Gadol was being forced to take a Shuvah, an oath. After he took that oath, he wept in privacy. And the people who made him take that oath, they too wept after parting ways from him. What was this oath and why was it required? What prompted tears on the holiest evening of the year, the only ritually described moment of crying in the whole body of the Mishnah? What prompted the oath and the tears? A crisis in the most foundational anchor that our world depends on. A crisis in trust. I want to tell the story about this breakdown in trust that led to the Yom Kippur night tears, because what our world is lacking and so desperately needs right now is trust. We can't fix that problem alone. We can't even fix most of that problem. But we can begin by trying to make ourselves the most trustworthy people we can be. And by emphasizing to the world that what we want for ourselves, what we want in our leaders, what we want in our communities is trust. I want to tell the story of this oath and its tears because there is no teshuvah without trust in each other, without trust in the institution of teshuvah itself, without some trust in God. And I want to tell this story because Yom Kippur marks the anniversary of a repair in one of the greatest crises in trust in our national history as a Jewish people, the sin of the golden calf. Starting to understand what went wrong and what got fixed can help us understand something about the foundations of trust, building ourselves to a better world. So thank you for joining me on this journey. The Mishnah in the first perek of Masechet Yoma, the tractate that tells us the story of the Yom Kippur service in temple times, narrates in the first chapter all the week-long preparations that the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, made in order to prepare for Yom Kippur. Chapter 1, Mishnah 5, describes a critical moment in that journey. It says, the elders of the court would pass him to the elders of the priesthood and take him up to the house of Avtinas. They administered an oath. This is on the night of Yom Kippur, just as we are saying Kol Nidre, and took leave of him and went on their way. When they administered the oath, they would say, my master high priest, we are agents of the court, and you are our agent. and an agent of the court. We administer an oath to you in the name of God, the one who housed God's name in this house, that you not change a word of what we have taught you of this week, over this week about the Yom Kippur service. Hu poresh uvoche, vehein poshin ubochin. He separated from them and cried, and they separated and cried. This Mishnah needs a close reading. It's a story which is told two times in two very different ways. The first telling is the first sentence of the Mishnah. They would take the high priest, hand him off from one group to another, administer an oath, v'niftaru v'halchu lahem, and go on their way. That should have been sufficient to narrate to us what we needed to know about what took place in the Kohen Gadol's preparation for Yom Kippur. But then the Mishnah tells the story again, this time filling in the details of the oath and the aftermath of parting ways. The elders address the Kohen Gadol personally. Ishi, my man, Kohen Gadol. You are our partner. But don't change anything we told you to do. And then in the second telling, we're not just told niftaru v'halchu lahem, they went on their way, but hu poreshu voche, he separated from them and cried, and they separated and cried. There's something about this two-layered telling of the story which grips me. So many moments in our lives have two layers. The simple version, the mere narration of the facts, and the emotional version. What's going on underneath the surface? Sometimes it's important to tell one, and sometimes it's important to tell the other, and sometimes it's important to tell both. The Mishnah needs us to know both, the bare facts of what happened and the feelings along with what happened. Why did the Kohen Gadol need to swear not to change anything from what he was instructed? Why would he have wanted to? And why did he cry? In source 2, the Gemara explains why the oath was necessary by way of explaining why the Kohen Gadol cried. Hu poreshu boche, he would separate and cry, shechashaduhu tziduki, because the elders of the Beit Din suspected him of being a Sadducee. Let me provide a little background. The last centuries of the Second Temple period were a time of great sectarianism in the Jewish community. The way the sages tell the story, one of the deep divides was between the Sadducees, the Tzedukim, an aristocratic stratum of society which descended from the priestly family of Tzadok, and who largely didn't believe in the binding authority of the oral tradition, in the fact that the rabbis continued to interpret the Torah, and that their interpretations were our guide. And the Perushim, the Pharisees, of whom we are the spiritual, religious, philosophical descendants. A much larger group, which included the forebears of our rabbis today, who believed in the continuing interpretation of the Torah through the principles of rabbinic exegesis. The masses generally aligned with the Pharisees, but there was bitter strife between the groups. This was not just a machloket like the machlokot of Beit Hillel and Shammai, l'shem shamayim, where God would say these and these are the words of the living God. These were bitterly disputed topics, social strife and division, and the groups did not trust one another. And amongst their differences of opinion were about how the Yom Kippur service was to be conducted. At its pinnacle moment, when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies and created a cloud of smoke by lighting and burning the incense, the Sadducees said that he needed to create that cloud outside the Holy of Holies and then carry it in. The Pharisees, the Perushim, said, first go in to the Holy of Holies and then light the incense cloud. The details of this difference are not as important as the fact that for them, it was a matter of life and death. Ketoret and the incense is often linked to life and death, whether it was the question of the fire pan test of Korach and his followers over Ketoret, or the death of Nadav and Avihu, who we understand to have improperly offered an incense offering. And certainly on the holiest day of the year, there was no room for making mistakes in the order of the service that was supposed to take place in the Holy of Holies for the high priest. conducting the service correctly was a matter of life and death. From the Gemara, it seems that sometimes there were Sadducees who attained the high priesthood. Some of the Kohanim Gedolim were Tzedukim. So the elders of the Beit Din, the Prushim, the Pharisees, our spiritual forebears, made the Kohen Gadol swear to do it their way, the right way, as our tradition dictates. As the Gemara imagines our Mishnah, the high priest we're talking about is a Pharisee. He was always ever intending to do the right thing, to burn the incense only when he got inside the Holy of Holies. Think about what he'd been through over the last month, the last week of painstaking preparation. He was committed to the process as the Prushim presented it to him. What must he have felt like on Yom Kippur night, being asked to swear what he knew for himself he was already going to do? It was a crushing demonstration of a lack of trust. That shred of suspicion persisted and gnawed at him. And so now the Mishnah tells us, Hu poresh, he separated. Poresh is a much stronger verb than the first version in the beginning of the Mishnah. Nifteru v'halchu lahem, they took their leave. Poresh is the language of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, when Hillel says, Al tifrosh min hatzibur, don't separate yourself from the community. Perhaps in this choice of word, hu poresh hu boche, the Mishnah is telling us this expression of mistrust from the Beit Din elders toward the Kohen Gadol alienated him, made him feel separated from the community he was striving to serve. Something in him breaks, and he weeps. Maybe the verb choice of poresh on the part of the Mishnah also offers another subtle hint. Hu poresh, hu parush. He was a Prushi. He was a Pharisee. Their suspicion is unfounded. The tears of the Kohen Gadol are so profound and so painful. They're the tears of a faithful servant being accused of disloyalty, being suspected of being the opposite of what he is and who he is. I think I would cry in his position. Maybe I have cried in his position. Sometimes our bayit, trying to manifest the deep Torah values of inclusivity and welcome and community that we so deeply believe in, has been accused by our fellow Prushim of not being faithful to our tradition, of not keeping the halakha, of not living up to the Torah's visions and values. How painful that is, because of how deep our commitment is to the tradition, mitzvot, and Torah that we share. But why did the elders of the Beit Din cry? The Gemara addresses this too, telling us in source 2. Hu poreshu boche shechashaduhu tzeduki. Vehem porshin ubochin. They turned aside and cried, the elders of the Beit Din, that is. De'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, kol hachoshed biksherim loke begufo. As Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, one who suspects the innocent is afflicted in his body. They cry because they understand the severity of suspecting someone falsely. The elders see the consequences of their actions. They see the tears, perhaps, that sprang forth from their sown seeds of distrust. If my reading of the verb choice of poresh is correct, then, ironically and painfully, hem poshin ubochin, they are alienated from the community and the Kohen Gadol too as a result of their suspicion. Despite both being members of the same group, both being pirushim, they're now separated by the gulf of mistrust. Let's follow the thread of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi's statement that anyone who suspects someone kosher, someone who's doing the right thing, is afflicted in their body. What is this phrasing meant to teach us? The source of his statement is expressed further in a Gemara in Shabbat, source 4. The Gemara says, Kol hachoshed biksherim loke begufo dichtiv. Anyone who suspects the innocent is afflicted in their body, as it says, quoting Moshe's comment, Hein lo ya'aminu li, they're not going to believe me, and yet God knew that the Jewish people were believers. And so God said to him, no, they are believers, the children of believers, but you will ultimately not be a believer, Moshe. And we bring proof texts that the Jewish people were believers, as it says later that they believed the signs and wonders Moshe taught them, and that they are children of believers, going all the way back to Abraham, a source we'll look at shortly. V'ha'amin ba'Hashem, Abraham, who believed in God. Mimai dilaka, and how do we know that someone who suspects, like Moshe suspected the Jewish people of not being believers, that person is afflicted? Tichtiv vayomer Hashem lo od havena yadcha b'chekecha. As God said to Moshe further, after he suspected them of not being believers, bring your hand into your cloak. And when Moshe brought it out, it was as leprous as snow. Let's explain. The Gemara quotes from Moshe's comments to God at the burning bush. While Moshe is busy trying every argument he can to get out of or explain his unworthiness to be God's messenger to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. He tells God, Hein lo yaminu li, they're not going to trust me. In a 9-verse passage in which the root Aleph Mem Nun for faith or trust appears 5 times. God responds by teaching Moshe 2 signs. The second of which is Moshe placing his hand in his cloak and when removing it, finding it covered with white sarat lesions. At first glance, when we read this story, the second seems just to be another wonder, another miracle of God's doing, showing Moshe God's divine powers that Moshe is then meant to bring to the Jewish people to show them. You don't believe me, Moshe? You don't believe I'm a messenger of God? You don't believe God? Look at the wondrous things I can do. But the Gemara reads it as a punishment for Moshe's lack of trust in the people's trust. So God afflicts him with this tzarat as a punishment for his distrust of the people, who, as the Gemara says, God knows are trusters and believers. And in fact, it does say at the very end of that chapter, God was right. When Moshe went to Bnei Israel in Egypt, finally acceding to God's mission, joins forces with Aaron, shows the signs and wonders, and relays God's words to the people, it says, Vaya'amein ha'am. The people did believe. Now, the Gemara would have been sufficient with just the beginning and the end. Say that Moshe suspected Bnei Israel of not believing. In fact, they did believe. And we know Moshe was stricken for this, because we see that he got tzarat right after he accused the Jewish people of not believing. But the Gemara adds this middle section, in which God says to Moshe, you know what? Not only were you wrong for mistrusting them, but you will become a non-believer yourself. Distrust and suspicion can be a sort of disease that spreads from one subject to another and ultimately makes one distrust everything. And that moment when Moshe actually becomes a non-believer, what's going on there? It's the moment when he hits the rock. He's preoccupied with the people's lack of trust and belief. Shimuna Hamorim, listen up, you rebels, he says to them, you non-believers. And in his obsessive preoccupation with their belief, he loses sight of the instructions God has given him. He no longer leans on God, and he becomes in that moment a non-believer, the very thing he's obsessively accusing the people of being. Sometimes when we obsess over distrusting others and become singularly focused on whatever that thing is that we want them to be doing right, we lose perspective of the bigger picture of vision and values we're supposed to be upholding. We become non-believers, untrustworthy ourselves. Maybe this is what's happening with the Beit Din elders as well. The distance they create by suspecting the Kohen Gadol alienates them. This is the contagious nature of distrust. Maybe it's that distance that makes them cry as well. Not just that they may have suspected someone kosher, but that the suspicion takes root in their heart and takes on a life of its own, changing them into an unrecognizable version of themselves. Sometimes distrusting is not actually about the thing itself at all either. Sometimes it's something we do to try to grasp control of a situation in a moment when we don't feel control. I think about this as a parent. Did you do your homework? Did you wash up like I asked you to? It's not that I really think my kids didn't do it. It's that sometimes after a difficult day or in a difficult moment, I want to exert control, assert authority over them, and I start checking if they did all the things that they're supposed to do. They probably did. And if they didn't, I shouldn't be expressing distrust. I should notice what's going on for me and why I'm trying to displace that onto a moment of distrust. Maybe we can all appreciate the negative effects on ourselves and on our communities of mistrust. But we also recognize that there are dangers out there in the world, that in some situations, trust can be naivete, over-trust, or foolishness. I've already mentioned that sometimes the high priests actually were Sadducees. And while the Gemara seems to indicate later on that even the Sadducee high priests were always willing to follow the Pharisee instructions for the Yom Kippur service, there was still reason for the elders of the Beit Din to be concerned that the service of the day would be done wrong by a Sadducee high priest. And the stakes of this issue were incredibly high for the Jewish people on our day of seeking national and personal forgiveness from God. So it's not that the elders of the Beit Din were somehow wrong in being concerned. We live in a world that's full of dangers and threats. While it's poisonous and corrosive on our relationships and our society not to trust, sometimes it can be risky and dangerous to trust. What are we supposed to do? In fact, the Yerushalmi on our Mishnah seems to focus on this lamentable catch-22. When it tries to explain why the Kohen Gadol cries, it answers like the Bavli, shenechshad, because he was suspected. But when it explains why the elders of the Beit Din cried, it gives a different answer. Hein poshinu bochin, they turned aside and cried, shetzarchu lechach, that they needed to do this at all. Their tears were not just because they were afraid of falsely mistrusting, the Babylonian Talmud's concern, but their tears were because we live in a world where there are things to be suspicious of. We live in a world where it's not always safe to trust. That alone is something to turn aside and cry about. Tonight, I want us to think about how we can create a world with more trust in it. I'm not suggesting we live in a world where there's nothing to suspect. All our CSS members could just enjoy davening, hang up their vests and radios and come inside, if that were the case. What I am concerned about is the challenge of containing suspicion within its proper boundaries. How we refrain from allowing suspicion, which is like a contagion, from creeping into the wrong places and dominating our lives. How do we stop ourselves from becoming controlled by fear and suspicion? This is key not just for our physical safety, but for our spiritual, social, and psychological well-being. Our world depends on the ability to keep mistrust in its proper, limited place and allow trust to grow to fill the rest of the space in our lives. From this foundational story of the Beit Din elders and the Kohen Gadol on this holy and high-stakes night, we've learned of the pain and the tears of not being trusted and the toxic impact on the one who suspects and the contagious nature of cynicism and distrust. In fact, breakdowns of trust of which we have been guilty are enumerated in many of the al-chaitz we're going to recite on Yom Kippur. Al-chet shechatanu lefanecha, for the sins that we've sinned before you, God. Bidat uvemirma, for deception. Bevidoi peh, with insincere confession, not meaning what we say. Bechachash uvechazav, with falsehood and lies. Bishvuat shav, with vain promises. Uvitsumet yad, literally placing our hand on something of someone else's, which the Koren Machzor translates as breach of trust. So much of what we're going to do on Yom Kippur is reflect on where we've broken trust and how to repair it with God and our fellow person. To unpack the question of how we broke and how we repair trust, we have to go back to the event that we were forgiven for and renewed from on Yom Kippur, the sin of the golden calf, of the Egel HaZahav. But first, I want to lay the groundwork a little bit more of the dynamics of trust, for which I turn to two of my Rebbes of Torah, emotion, and psychology, the two Browner Rebbes, Dr. Erica Brown and Dr. Brene Brown, no relation as far as I know. Trust is eroding in our society. Not in all groups or among all peoples. In fact, in Europe, studies show that trust in government and trust in the reliability of many professions is rising. But in our nation, trust in government over the last 60 plus years has plummeted from about 70% to about 20%. Staggering. According to the General Social Survey in the United States, in answering the statement, most people can be trusted, the people who agree with that has gone down in the last half century from 46% to about 32%. Only a third of us think that most of our fellow citizens can be trusted. I'm one of that 33%. Where do we find ourselves? Do we think our fellow Americans can be trusted? Our neighbors? And of course, we only have to think for an instant about Medinat Yisrael to look at the breakdown of trust. At sides who I believe in their core want the same things: good life, a healthy, functioning country, peace, but who've become so blinded by the issues of the day that we fall into a place of profound, profound distrust. It's devastating, and it's devastating us. What is the Torah of trust? Dr. Erica Brown, whose Torah I really enjoyed sharing with many of you over the summer in our Modern Jewish Thinkers series. Recordings are up on our Bayit YouTube page and our website. Who does a lot of Jewish organizational leadership research, writing and consulting, talks about the importance of trust in Jewish professional life. She highlights the first place the Torah uses the verb for trust, or one verb for trust, Aleph Mem Nun. It's in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, the very spot that in the Gemara, when God was telling Moshe, the Jewish people are believers, the descendants of the first believer, it's the place the Gemara quotes. It's an early story in the relationship between God and Abraham. What do we know about Avram's early relationship with God? Avram has been promised a few things that have not yet come to pass, most notably a child. He has had a few documented conversations with God, and otherwise he's been busy fleeing famine, protecting his family, navigating a slightly complicated relationship with his nephew, and then fighting a war to help rescue that nephew, and then turning down the spoils of war. Now God comes to him in a key moment in their relationship. Breshit chapter 15. And the Torah says, sometime later the word of the Lord came to Avram in a vision. Al tira Avram, fear not Avram. I will protect you, and your reward will be great. And Avram says, Hashem, what can you give me? I'm going to die childless. I have no heir but my steward. And God comes to him saying, no, Eliezer will not be your heir, but it will be one who issues forth from you. And God takes him outside and says, look up to the heavens, habet na hashamayim usfoa kochavim, count the stars, if you even can. Ko yezarecha, so will be your offspring. V'hemin b'Hashem, and Avram trusted in God. Vayachsheveha lo tzedakah, and deemed it as an act of righteous merit. So God comes to Avram and reiterates that God will protect him. Avram asks a question. What does this mean? And actually, just a few verses after this, Avram asks another question of God. How do I know that I'm going to inherit? Clearly indicating to us that emunah is not at odds with questions. Before the key verse of V'hemin b'Hashem of Avram showing trust and faith in God, he asks a question, and he asks another one afterwards. Faith and questions have to go hand in hand. Trust and questions have to go hand in hand. And after God shows him the stars and tells him something Avram can't possibly even imagine, that's how many children he will have when he still has none, we're told that Avram Ha'emin Adonai, trusts in God. And then we are told, Vayachsheveha lo tzedakah. It was deemed an act of charity, a gift. What was deemed an act of charity? By whom? To whom? Let's take a moment to look at the Bechor Shor, who summarizes the two central opinions interpreting this verse. And he believed in Hashem, that's Abraham, and who considered it to be righteous. The Bechor Shor says, Avraham considered it to be tzedakah, a righteous act of God. God did righteousness with him, promising him that one who came out of his loins would inherit the land. Avraham trusted in God that this as yet unimaginable thing, the blessing of a child through which the other promises would be fulfilled, that this would come to pass. And Avraham considered that promise from God an act of tzedakah, an act of kindness, a gift. The Bechor Shor continues. And there are those who explain, Yesh mefarshim, Shakadosh Baruch Hu chishev la'Avraham tzedakah al shehe'emino, that God considered to be an act of righteousness on Avraham's part, that Avraham believed in God. Ve'ein nireh li, says the Bechor Shor, doesn't seem to me like that's the right interpretation. Ki mi lo yamin be'el ha'ne'eman, because who would possibly not believe in, and he makes it almost tautological. He doesn't just say who would possibly believe in God, he says who would possibly believe in El HaNe'eman, the trustworthy God. I love the Bechor Shor's astonishment at the second interpretation. But even more than that, I love the second interpretation itself. Of course it was a generous act on Abraham's part to trust God. Trust is always an act of generosity. Of course, for the Bechor Shor, God was El HaNe'eman, looking back 2,500 years later at a patriarch whose promises came true, who was gifted a child and another child, who was gifted progeny like the stars, who was gifted a nation that still reads and speaks about and blesses him as our patriarch today. Of course, God was a faithful God for the Bechor Shor looking back for Avraham. But for Avraham, just embarking on a relationship with this God, for God, the character, in a developing relationship with Avraham, of course Abraham's faith was an act of generosity. It was a gift. That's why the verse is ambiguous, I believe, because both are true. And Dr. Erica Brown deepens her analysis of trust when she writes, Avraham had what Stephen Covey calls high trust in Covey's book, The Speed of Trust. In a high trust relationship, Covey writes, you can say the wrong thing and people will still get your meaning. In a low trust relationship, you can be very measured, even precise, and they'll still misinterpret you. Strong relationships depend on high trust, where we give others the benefit of the doubt, assume good intentions, and give each other encouragement to dream big together. In high trust relationships, people are given the space to fail, as long as there is honesty, clarity, and encouragement. Inherently, we believe in the goodness of each person we work with and assume goodwill. Covey believes that we all have trust accounts, but that withdrawals are bigger than deposits. That's important. Withdrawals are bigger than deposits. If someone breaks trust, it's difficult, but not impossible, to repair the relationship. Dr. Erica Brown writes, in my own experience, some people are naturally trusting, and their default in personal and professional relationships is to trust first. Others are more skeptical and suspicious. And I would add, there's not a right or a wrong way to be, but it helps us to know where we fall on that spectrum of more or less trusting. Like Avraham, she concludes, we are willing to go through fire and move mountains when we are in profound relationships of trust. But without trust, we get trapped in suspicion, gossip, petty insults, and perceived offenses. This description of the high trust relationship feels to me like a description of Abraham and God's relationship in so many ways, a model for us. They reach out time and time again to do for each other. They charitably read each other's intentions, and they build a relationship of trust over many small steps. And the power of that trust is that it carries them through a beautiful and long relationship of God and Abraham, the foundational relationship for our faith, the power of trust. I remember talking not that long ago to a friend, happily married, for whom money was a little tight. Food shopping and food preparation was in the domain of his spouse. And he always said she did it smoothly, beautifully, and lovingly. But he was responsible for the credit card bills. And he always got stuck when he saw the costs of their food expenditures. It felt high to him. And it did something to his relationship with her in his own head. As we talked about it, I remember asking him, "Do you trust her?" And he said to me, "Yes, absolutely." So I said to him, "If you remind yourself when you look at those credit card bills that you trust her, and that the anxiety is coming from your worry about having enough money, but not actually about whether you trust that she's spending the money in the right way, I think you'll be able to let go of this feeling." And he told me some number of months later that he was. That's the power of trust. The metaphor of tzedakah that the Torah uses to describe Abraham's trust in God in the Bechor Shor's second interpretation, Vayachsheveha lo tzedakah, that God treated Abraham's trust as tzedakah. The metaphor of tzedakah for trust is beautiful. Dr. Brené Brown, social psychology guru, author, and podcaster, and someone whose Torah on human relationships I deeply admire, talks about trust as a marble jar. In her research, we build trust in surprisingly small moments of noticing each other, helping each other, giving to each other. Like the coins in a tzedakah box, like the trust account that Stephen Covey talks about. Trust builds slowly but surely. There aren't really grand moments most of the time, a lot of little ones. And Brené Brown's research showed that the experiences and moments that people pointed to as important for helping them build trust in others were the moments when people noticed something they were going through and asked about it, the moments when people showed up for them in a time of need, and the moments when people were willing to ask them for help. The people who knew how to be present with vulnerability and share vulnerability were the ones who could be trusted. And so Brené Brown talks about 7 dimensions of trust. And it's actually helpful to break it down into these 7 distinct categories, because these are all ways we build trust in our relationships. When there's a breakdown in trust, sometimes it helps us to notice that it's actually only in one area and we're doing okay in the other 6. Sometimes we're able to work on building trust in one area, even when we're not able to work on it in another. So breaking trust down into its component parts, what she calls the anatomy of trust, is an important exercise. And I want to share those 7 with you. Hopefully you can see them. I know the script is not too big. The acronym for it is braving, because as Brené Brown says, what we're doing when we trust is braving a relationship with another. And here they are. B, boundaries, clarity about our own limits in relationships in our lives. R, reliability, consistently doing what we say we will, which means not always saying yes. A, accountability, acknowledging our mistakes, apologizing, and trying to fix what we can. V, the vault, preserving the confidences of others, not engaging in gossip. If I come to talk to another person and I hear them tell me something that's going on about someone else's life, I might not lean into trusting them. Integrity, I, choosing courage over comfort, not just professing, but practicing our values. N, non-judgment, holding vulnerability without assumption or judgment. G, generosity. If we make a mistake, others will be forthright and assume good intention. Braving. This is what we're trying to build with each other. Which resonates most with you? What letter out of braving are you struggling with? Are you growing in? Are you feeling proud of? I'm thinking about R, reliability. I always want to say yes. I always want to do more. But it becomes counterproductive if I say yes and I can't follow through. Brené Brown gives the example of running into an acquaintance in a coffee shop you haven't seen for a long time. It's so good to see you. I've missed you. How have you been? And then that instinct, as we're parting ways, to say, I'm going to give you a call. Let's get together sometime. it wouldn't hurt us to leave that sentence out. We could still call even if we didn't say we were going to. But when we say we will and we don't follow through, we hurt our reliability, our trustworthiness. There's such a good instinct to overpromise, but then we run the risk of under-delivering. Better to underpromise and over-deliver. To trust and to be trusted, what's the change we want to make this year? To really understand how trust breaks and is rebuilt, we have to bring the Torah of Erica Brown and Brene Brown into the Torah of the Jewish people, into perhaps the most excruciating breach of trust between Bnei Israel and Hashem and Moshe, and try to understand how it was rebuilt, because the anniversary of its rebuilding is on Yom Kippur. I refer to the unthinkable, astonishing sin of the golden calf. Our courtship with God begins in Egypt. We date as we go through the plagues, the splitting of the sea, and our early wilderness journeys, not your typical courtship. And we concretize our relationship at Mount Sinai. And then weeks later, when Moshe seems to be tarrying and coming down the mountain, the people converge on Aharon and demand a new object of worship, a leader, a god. It's not totally clear. And we know the story. Aharon creates the golden calf, the Jewish people worship it, God gets angry, Moshe intervenes, and God ultimately agrees to spare the Jewish people. The sin here is not just the brazen idolatry, it seems, but the breach of trust, the fracture in the relationship with Moshe, with God. Moshe actually left them instructions before he went up the mountain. He told them, Mi bal devarim yigash aleihem, referring to Aharon and Hur. If you need something, draw close to Aharon and Hur. They will be there for you. Turn to them while I'm gone. Trust me that I've left you in trusted hands. But the trusting relationship went out the window. What was the Shuvah for this paradigmatic sin of the Jewish people? We know what the punishments were. Plagues, death, killing. But what was the Shuvah? Somehow it will need to encompass not just the idolatry, but the breach in trust. We know all about how Moshe fights for the Jewish people. He makes all kinds of arguments to God. What will the other nations say if they see you take this people out of Egypt and then destroy them? They're worthy. They are your people. And God ultimately accedes to Moshe's defenses of the Jewish people. But what do the Jewish people actually do? There's kapara, there's atonement. But is there tshuva? Is there a repair of the relationship? Or do we just move on because Moshe fought for us and try to figure things out going forward? I believe the answer is yes. There is a moment of tshuva. There is a moment of rebuilding the trust. But it's subtle. Because remember, the withdrawals are usually bigger than the deposits. The breaches are bigger than the rebuildings. The rebuildings are in many small steps. Trust is built in small moments of showing up, of noticing, of holding vulnerability. It's with this in mind that I went back to Shemot chapter 34, when Moshe placates God and the second tablets are given. Remember the chronology of that year, that summer and fall, as the rabbis tell it. On Shavuot, we have the great revelation on Har Sinai. Moshe then spends 40 days on the mountain while we build the golden calf, and comes down on the 17th of Tammuz, smashing the luchot. He then goes back to God and spends 40 days entreating on our behalf, after which God says, yes, there will be another chance, and Moshe goes up again on Rosh Chodesh Elul, spends those 40 days with God, and comes down again, cementing our forgiveness on Yom Kippur, the end of the third period of 40 days. In those moments when Moshe comes down again, what do we find? Source 12 narrates it. God said to Moshe, write these commandments. I'll make a covenant with you and Israel. Moshe was there with God 40 days and 40 nights, ate no bread and drank no water, and wrote down the terms of the covenant. And then Moshe came down from Har Sinai. As he came down, he wasn't aware that his face was radiant, for he had spoken with God. Aharon and all of the Israelites saw that Moshe's face was radiant. Vayiru migeshet elav. And they were afraid of drawing close to him. Vayikra alehem Moshe, so Moshe called out, Vayashuvu elav, and they came back again to him. Who? Aaron, the princely leaders, and Moshe spoke to them. V'acharechein nigshu kol bnei Yisrael, and then all of bnei Yisrael drew close. Notice these key verbs. At first, bnei Yisrael are afraid migeshet elav, to draw near. So he calls out, Vayashuvu elav, and Aaron and the princes, our leaders, model to Shuvah, literally returning. They come back to Moshe. V'acharechein, and after all of that, nigshu b'nei Yisrael, the Israelites come close. It's actually the same word as what Moshe told them they were supposed to do when he went up at the beginning of the first 40 days. Aaron and Hur are with you. If you have a matter, a concern, yigash aleihem, draw near to them. But instead they didn't. They gathered themselves upon Aaron. Vayikahel al Aharon. Only now do they draw near. Compare these moments to last time. First of all, when Moshe comes down, no small matter. The people are waiting faithfully. Maybe it's because they didn't perceive him as tarrying this time. They thought he was on time. Maybe it's because they learned their lesson, put their trust in the process, and stayed in the game, waiting faithfully for Moshe to come down. And then, following the model of their leaders of Vayashuvu, of returning, of the language of Shuvah, they hold faith, they trust, and they come close. They lean into the rebuilding of the relationship. Sometimes that's scary, to ask for trust or to give trust again after a breach. But it's perhaps the most important thing we can do. Lageshet, to draw near again. In these few lines, we have the restoration of the relationship. What I believe the teshuvah actually was. It's not grand and glamorous like the sin was. It's the drawing near again. A people that 80 days earlier, just over a month removed from revelation, broke trust, didn't rely on Moshe's commitment to them and God's reliability, now waits patiently and overcomes their fear to return, their fear to draw close. They hold the space, they lean in, and they reconnect. They make a major deposit in the trust account. Because in the end of the day, rebuilding trust takes time, and it comes down to the small things. The desire to stay in relationship, draw near, and keep to your word. I broke trust with a loved one this year. Not intentional. I mean, I knew I was doing it, but I didn't want to hurt them. And in the weeks following that breach, I found it hard to know how to navigate the relationship. The breach hung in the space between us whenever we were together, and it was hard to know how to talk, how to act, how to be normal. Knowing I had hurt the other person, I was always leaning out, leaning away, thinking that trying to be close again would somehow be an offense, would just irritate the breach. But sometimes naming it, and sometimes not naming it, expressing the desire to be close again, were some of the small steps of putting the marbles in the jar, the tzedakah in the trust account. The underlying issues had to be addressed. Figuring out the way forward had to be addressed. But a big part of it just came from saying, I still want our relationship to be close. I know I did wrong, but I want to trust, and I want to seek trust. One last note on this Egel HaZahav repair that we are commemorating on Yom Kippur. The Ramban on these psukim tells us that what happens right after the rebuilding of the trust in Bnei Yisrael's drawing near and doing tshuva was something very significant. He writes, interweaving his comments with quoting the psukim, he narrates what was happening when Moshe came down after those last 40 days with the second luchot. He told them the tidings of the forgiveness of their sin, and when the children of Israel saw that he spoke with the princes, they all came near, and then he commanded them everything God had said, and all that was said to him from the beginning of these earlier verses, and told them, Ki higid lahem, shetzivahu lichrot imahem brit chadasha, Al pi hadvarim ha'eleh. He then told Bnei Israel that God had commanded him to establish a new breed, a new covenant on the words that they had spoken about earlier. Ramban here is referencing an earlier pasuk where God had expressed the desire for a renewed covenant. Moshe had convinced God of Bnei Israel's worthiness, opening up the desire and the possibility of rebuilding. But it was only after Bnei Israel made their trust account deposit, after they came close again, after the breach and the break and the distance, after their Shuvah and their drawing near, that Moshe could introduce a new breed, a new covenant. And in fact, if we go back to that first moment of trust, that first moment of faith with Avram and God, v'ha'emin ba'Hashem, in the psukim that immediately follow, we find Brit Bein HaBetarim, our foundational national covenant with God, expressed through our first patriarch, through Abraham. Only after Abraham showed trust, invested in the relationship with God, could the covenant be built. Covenant and contract are two different things. As Dr. Erica Brown writes about Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sacks' teachings, contracts are agreements between people and parties that are often situational, time-limited, and to achieve goals that reflect self-interest. Covenants are the attempts to create partnership without dominance or submission. Covenants are the way we think about our binding commitments with one another, the ways we strive to grow, the way we strive to hold trust. We're all participants in the covenant Avraham Avinu established with God and God with him after that moment of V'ha'emin ba'Hashem, of the new covenant that God established with the Jewish people on the giving of the second Luchot on Yom Kippur. We each have our own deep, complex, theological, personal relationships with God. But at a most basic level, what V'ha'emin ba'Hashem can mean is to know ourselves to be part of that covenant, to know that we're part of a people with a mutual commitment to our God, to lean into a relationship with each other, to hold to our shared values of goodness and kindness. That's what trust can beget, covenantal relationships. We've spoken about the dangers of distrust, about how we break and build trust with God as a model for human trust, nationally and individually, and about the way the halakha stretches to try to create opportunities for trust in community. And in fact, a lot of this is summarized in the Mishnah we looked at all the way back in source 3. I'm not even sure I shared the source sheet at that moment, but when we were talking about hu poreshu bocheh, the high priest separating and crying, we noticed the language in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot of Al Tifrosh Min Hatzibur. Don't separate yourself from the community. This Mishnah has excerpt of the Mishnah has three different statements that are all about trust. Al Tifrosh Min Hatzibur. Don't separate from the community. Trust the community. Try to find ways to lean into and be a part of community. Even when we feel ourselves in one way or another at odds with the community, don't separate fully. Figure out ways to be connected and build our communal infrastructure. Even in the moments when we are accused by our fellow co-religionists of somehow not being faithful, not being loyal, we don't separate ourselves. We lean in. We rebuild. And the third part of the Mishnah, Al tadin et chavercha ad shetagia limkomo. Don't judge your fellow individual till you've reached their place, which we never reach. That's the N in Brene Brown's non-judgment in the Braving acronym. In the realm of individual relationships, we assume good intentions. We incline towards trusting the behavior of the other. But it's the middle one that stands out to me. Al ta'amin ba'atzmecha ad yom motcha. In between trust in the community and trust in the other, Hillel tells us, don't trust yourself, not until the day you die. Don't trust yourself. I struggle with this line in Pirkei Avot. Of course, it's a necessary corrective to overconfidence or self-centeredness or reaching a place where we're sure we can always trust ourselves. And the sages actually bring an example here, commenting on this Mishnah, that takes us all the way back to the beginning of tonight. They tell us the story of Yonatan the Kohen Gadol, known alternately as John Hyrcanus, who served as a Perushi Pharisee high priest for 80 years and then defected to become a Sadducee. So yes, have the humility to know that we are all vulnerable to error, to mistakes, and be conscious of that. But maybe for the purpose of interpretation of this Mishnah, I want to differentiate between emunah and bitachon. If emunah is a sort of absolute, unbreakable faith of certainty, it's that which we don't necessarily want to blindly place in ourselves. But bitachon, trust, I humbly submit, and I hope Hillel, the author of this Mishnah, would agree. Tavtiach ba'atzmecha, kol yamecha. Try to build trust in yourself every day. Use the same tools that Brene Brown gave us about trust in others. Be charitable to yourself about your shortcomings, the one only you know about. Yes, call them out to yourself. Be accountable for them. But be generous about what might have prompted them, and then do better. Hold your own vulnerabilities without judgment. Know your boundaries. Keep your own confidences. Honor the things that belong just in our hearts. Because we actually need to trust ourselves more, to believe in ourselves and what we have to offer the world. Building trust in ourselves, I believe, is a key piece of a healthy psychological, emotional, spiritual, productive life. I was moved when talking with a friend in the Elul season about goals for the coming year, when he said to me, someone I admire as an accomplished professional, I want to trust myself more. I want to put my voice out there in conversation more and believe that what I have to say will contribute. I trust him, and I bless us for a year of self-trust and self-growth. And like every relationship, the relationship between rabbi and community also functions on trust. Trust built on all those little deposits of showing up for each other, the drawing near that Bnei Israel did after the sin of the golden calf, of reliability, of non-judgment, of the vault of confidentiality and respecting each other's stories, of accountability and generosity, knowing that I can own up to my mistakes, and knowing that 15 years later, there is still room to err and to repair. I carry with me every day something Rav Avi said to me 8 years ago at my installation. He said, Toby and I entrust you with our life's work. I wake up every morning truly feeling that trust, not just from Rav Avi and Toby, but from each and every one of you. I wake up every morning feeling it, but I don't take it for granted, not any day. And tonight I want to say thank you for it. Thank you for the trust. May we continue to build the trust, lean on it and lean into it as we grow as a body for many more years to come. In closing, we return to our high priest and to the elders of the Beit Din on that fateful Yom Kippur night, the night whose anniversary we observe tomorrow night. Because there's a truly beautiful irony about this anniversary. The oath the elders make the high priest take is a reflection, as we've said, of their lack of trust in the high priest. Because they don't know that he will conduct the service the way they need him to, they make him swear, hoping that if he wouldn't do it on its own merits, he'll do it because he took an oath to do it, maybe even invoking God's name in that oath. Thousands of years later, tomorrow night, on the anniversary of that oath, how do we start Yom Kippur? We annul our vows and our oaths. And I think there's something about doing this at the beginning of Yom Kippur and the way that we do it in solemn melody and in community that helps us aspire to create a world filled with more trust, a world in which we are more trustworthy, and a world in which we trust each other more. Why do we have vows and promises in the world? They wouldn't have any reason for existence in a world in which trust and trustworthiness were complete. Sometimes we say, I promise, to allay a concern that we might not do what we say we will do or what we are supposed to do. Sometimes we elicit vows from others in contemporary courtrooms or in front of the entryway to the Holy of Holies 2,000 years ago, or in the daily moments and spaces of our lives because we don't trust that others will do what they're supposed to do without that promise, which couldn't be further from the covenantal approach to relationships that Rabbi Sachs describes, in which we act in trustworthy ways, and therefore we don't have to make promises or take vows. We make and elicit oaths because we aren't trustworthy and we don't trust. When we annul our vows on the eve of Yom Kippur, part of what we're doing is reflecting on that painful reality, the promises we haven't kept. We're asking to be spared from our own untrustworthiness. We're opening up the entire day of Yom Kippur with a meditation on our unfulfilled promises, a meditation that ideally leads us to want to enter next Yom Kippur with fewer unfulfilled promises that need to be annulled. Next year, let's be people who fulfill our promises, people who can really be trusted. But there's a more radical aspiration expressed in Kol Nidre I want to suggest. Come Yom Kippur night in our nullification, we're expressing a hope, a goal, a dream. To live in a world where we don't need vows or oaths. Ushvuatana la shavuot, when oaths are no more oaths. Why? Because we're braving our relationships. We're showing up for each other, giving each other the gift of trust, one moment at a time. Trusting ourselves, trusting each other, trusting community, trusting our covenantal relationship with God. Then we won't need oaths or vows anymore. We'll have covenant, emunah, and trust. May we keep working our way closer to that dream, as individuals, as a family, as a bayit, as a Jewish people, as a world. Ahai, 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 ushvuatana la shivu. Shana Tova. Shana Tova.